Let's have a few more breaks. We're really not one yet, but we will have a few more breaks. And I'm quite excited about this because Helen has been talking to me about taxonomy and we've been sort of having conversations about the taxonomy that the OU uses and also sort of issues with categorizing learning. So I'm really excited about this talk, and I hope you are too. And I think it raises some of the a lot of questions that we tend to get when we are presenting research presentations as well. Well, how do you actually work out? How do you put things into each box? Yes, I'm very interested to hear more about Helen's perspective on this. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Lizette, for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here and be part of this network. I do feel a bit out of my depth, really, so please be gentle with me. I've been working at Staffs Uni for about 10 years now, working on originally the Best Practice Models project, which was a network of e-learning developers sharing expertise, and out of that I'm now working as an e-learning developer, developing distance learning and blended learning. But at Staffs, it's quite a small unit. There's only really me, and we've got quite a number of courses running distance learning, but it's very much a cottage industry. So what I want to talk to you about today is I've put at the bottom here, I don't know if you can see it, I've actually, because there's a lot more people here than I was expecting, so at the bottom here there's a link to my blog. It's actually got these slides and the document I'm referring to later on. So if you want to go to that, it's blogs.staffs.ac.uk/HW9, and that will take you to these slides if you want to follow them. And it's got the document, and there's various other bits and pieces. I'll say it again, this screen's not very bright, is it? It's blogs.staffs.ac.uk/HW9. There's no www at the beginning. So what I want to do is to just talk briefly about why we might want to categorise learning activities. So I'm not looking at the whole of the design, I'm just looking at a very small, specific learning activity part of it. A brief review of a couple of existing taxonomies and what has actually already been done to try and use those taxonomies to categorise those activities. The work that I've done before on as part of my work developing distance learning and how I decided to use that to develop something further. And then the work that I'm actually doing for my doctoral study, which is on looking at some way of content analysis for e-learning for online activities. Okay, I'm very interested in your feedback, so please stop me at any point if you've got any questions or you want me to clarify anything. So the first question is your question really, why would we want to categorise learning activities? Why would we want to categorise them? Why would we want to say what kind of learning activity is? What is the point of it? Why would you see a need for it? Do you see a need for it? To compare them, yeah? So you can compare them.
So you can think about different types of learning that you're asking for.
Yeah, so you're actually thinking about the learning that's as part of those activities, yeah?
So you've got shared vocabulary.
Shared vocabulary, yeah, that's crucial, yeah.
And the appropriate evaluation related
Yeah, and to evaluate them. Okay, and that was kind of where I started really. So essentially it's to do with, it's very small, it's to do with representing those learning activities. What do we actually call them? How might we compare them? How might we evaluate them? And how might we share them? And I think until when I was trying to do this originally, these were some of the challenges that I was finding. And some other work in my doctoral study looks further at the language that we use. So there's a number of existing taxonomies that exist. So these are taxonomies, these are groups of words that are used to describe learning activities. So I'm sure you're familiar with these. So we've got two sets I'm referring to here. So there's the Ulster University set, who created a set of activities that include receives, debates, experiments, creates, explores, practices, imitates, and meta-learns. That's a fairly good set of learning activity types. And then Dan Lorillard has developed that in a slightly different version, which includes acquisition, discussion, investigation, practice, collaboration, production. And there are various other types that are quite similar to those that overlap them. Okay, so they exist, and there's some around. The JISC Pedagogical Vocabularies Project did quite a big study of these types of taxonomies, and they reported that there was a lack of common understanding and shared vocabularies for pedagogical practice, even despite these taxonomies. That not everybody used the same one, and they didn't all mean the same things to everybody. So that there was definitely a lack of common understanding across teachers, system developers, learning technologists, and e-learning researchers. And the Mod4L project also identified issues with a lack of a common language, because that meant we can't describe activities, we can't then describe learning designs, we can't compare at the bigger scale. So there's already been work that's been done on looking at what taxonomies there are that we can use, but also highlighting some of the issues. And then some other issues that I became aware of. There was an example, and perhaps Dan won't remember, that I read an article where she'd been using the learning designer to map activities to teaching and learning activity types. So I think your activities, where you were asking teachers to categorise their own learning activities in the learning designer, that seemed to work okay. But when the activities were given to somebody else and they tried to do the same task, it didn't work. And this was a little bit in one of your articles, and I thought, that's really interesting. It seems obvious. You know, why didn't that quite work? So we had a bit of an email correspondence where I asked you for a bit more information, and sure enough, you confirmed that, in fact, it just didn't work very well at all, and you suggested some reasons. But other people have found the same issue. So, what's her name? Susan Swan, in the US, did a project looking at assessing MOOC pedagogies, and they tried the same task. So they wanted to try and identify the pedagogies that MOOCs were made up of, and so they did a massive, really big project to look at what kinds of tasks were involved in their MOOC. And they used an extensive period of group discussions. They all sat round a table, looked at their MOOC activities, and argued till the cows came home until they could agree on what those pedagogies were. But what was interesting, and again I emailed her to say, you know, did this really work? And she said, no, it was really difficult, trying to get everybody to agree on the same categorisation. And then Lisette and I first became in contact with each other because I read Lisette's article where she said that they'd been doing a similar task here with the Open University, looking at activities and trying to map them to try and create categories of groupings. And so quite a large mapping activity, and she did say again how difficult it is, how challenging to map categories to learning activities. Has anybody else tried this out of interest? Anybody else tried to do this? Yeah? Yeah? Does it work?
It's difficult.
Yeah, difficult. Yeah. It is difficult, yeah.
I just remember the endless discussions we used to have on learning design projects.
I know when I told you I was doing this, you just laughed at me.
I didn't do that.
No, don't do that. It's mad. No,
Very sorry.
no, in a nice way, in an encouraging way. Yes, I think this has been an issue that's been around for quite some time. And it was something that I, maybe foolishly, decided to investigate further. And initially it came out of something that I'd been developing myself. So as part of my work as an e-learning developer at Staffs Uni, I developed what I call the best practice principles for e-learning. And it was a basic framework, a template. It's based on Shirley Salmon's and some other work. And it essentially suggests to developers that they develop activities that follow a four-phased approach. And that each phase is increasingly more student-centred and more open. So that you think about your activities along a scale. It's John Stevenson's work, actually, where you think of your activities as either being closed with a fixed answer or open with endless answers, and also about a task that is either managed by the teacher, they decide what the students do and how to do it, or a task that is managed by the students. And if you kind of cross these over, you get these four quadrants. And this was my idea here. Because what I was aware of when I was talking to our staff who were hard pressed with time, they didn't think of themselves as learning designers, they were developing their own distance learning courses. We don't have a team of developers, staff were doing it themselves. And what I was conscious of, that what they were creating were very overly managed courses. So the tutors were creating tasks with a fixed answer that they could manage, and so the students would do a comprehension question with an answer and then they'd move on to the next one. And I thought, we're not really allowing students the full range of activities that the online distance learning facility enables. So this developed out of my work to try and give a framework to staff to encourage them to think about their activities as moving through these 4 phases. What I was conscious at the time was that, yeah, I've done all this and it's based on all this research and all this great long bibliography, but how did I evaluate it? I had no idea how to evaluate whether a course that had used this model to develop the course was any better than a course that didn't use this model. So I became very interested in how we might evaluate these kind of learning activities that were being produced out of this. So for my doctoral study, what I decided to do was to try and find a way to categorise the learning activities so that we could evaluate them, so that we could measure them, so that we could then ultimately compare them to retention data, alongside all the other things that we know impact on retention. So I would use retention as a way to measure whether or not this learning model actually worked. So essentially what I did was to develop a code book of categories. Now I've actually brought a sample here. There weren't as many of you at the last meeting, so I've only brought about 10 copies, but I've mentioned that I've got the one available online. So if I pass out a few of these, just have a look at them. If you can see it online, if you want to just pass it the hard copy around to somebody else, would that be okay? So you can see what it looks like.
It's a link from the blog.
It is, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you need the blog address again?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Is it the EDAT training sample?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I should have been in there.
Yeah.
Okay, blogs.staff.ac.uk/HW9. No www. And then there's the links to the slides, and then there's a link to this document I've just handed out. Okay, so essentially what I did was to develop a content analysis of the learning activities, which is a very detailed process which I developed. Essentially, I developed a set of categories, the code book, with the terminology, and you'll see the final version in front of you, but when I started off it was slightly different. Have you got, can everybody see one? Is anybody who can't see one at all?
Oh, yeah.
Is there anybody who can't see one? Okay, sorry, I wasn't expecting so many, so it's a good and bad thing. So I developed a code book, the categories, and originally the categories were based on the template. So I had, what now looks rather naively, I had my categories that were based on the principles on this. So I had, is the activity tutor managed or student managed, or is the activity closed or open? Does it include feedback? Does it include interaction? So a fairly, what I thought was a straightforward set of categories. I then analysed I identified the actual part of the text, the activity text I wanted to analyse. So if I just go back to what I was saying earlier, so at Staff's Uni, our staff are developing their own courses pretty much on their own. We don't have a developer team, we don't have a group of learning designers for them to work with, so they're developing them themselves. And some of these reflected a wide variety of types of activity in the way they were describing them. So the first task was to look at the actual activities that they had in their distance learning course and to break them down into what I call the activity segment. So typically a task wouldn't be terribly well written. So for example, it would say, have a think about this, read this material, and then answer this question, put it on the blog, and the whole thing would all be a single stream, for example. People are nodding, they're using the same kind of thing. So essentially, my first task was to identify these activities from the distance learning course and then segment them into the actual activity parts, using the activity verbs to guide them. Then I trained my raters. So originally, these are my colleagues at the university who volunteered, and I gave them cookies and coffee at the first round, trained them on the categories, which were about, is this task student managed or tutor managed, is it open or closed, these principles. They agreed that this terminology was easy to understand, it made sense to them. They then attempted the categorisation task, and it fell apart. And I experienced exactly the same issues that I'd already seen in the literature. People adding in extra columns, adding in arrows, commenting, all sorts of random things. I was astonished. I was astonished. And I thought, I've done such a bad job of this. This chart is completely wrong. I've worded it completely wrong. So I changed it. Changed the wording. Changed it from being tutor managed to tutor chooses the task, for example. So I operationalised the language. Tried it again. Not as many cookies this time, and asked my raters to try again. Same problem. And I thought there's something much more serious happening here. It can't just be my chart. I tried 5 times with different sets of categories. Some of the attempts, I didn't even bother doing the statistical analysis because I could look at it and see overall there was no way that my raters agreed. What I'd actually asked them to do was very challenging, as I realise now, because what I'd actually asked them to do was to categorise each of the learning activities against this criteria independently. Now I know that some of the other works I'd looked at have done it in groups, people all sitting together talking around the table. I'd given them the code book, the chart, I'd given them the tasks, and I'd set them on their own. And I've actually, the photo here is 2 of my colleagues with brows furrowed at the later stages doing the task under exam conditions. And they didn't get the cookies till right at the end either. So this was a really hard, challenging task for them to do. And they also all did all of the categorisation. So instead of each person doing a separate course, for example, I actually asked them all to do everything. So in some of the recommendations for content analysis, you need sufficient overlap for statistical analysis. Because of what I'd seen earlier, I decided everybody would do everything so that we could then try and measure the inter-rater reliability. Because my theory was, my hypothesis is, that if I could get all 4 people to do the same task, the same units of activity, the same categories, if they could all agree, then the chart could be used by somebody else more or less objectively. And then we would have a way to categorise our learning activities that we could then compare and evaluate and so on. So we did this, as I say, 5 times, and the inter-rater reliability was measured using Krippendorff's alpha. This is my lone statistical tool here. I'm not a maths expert. This part of my study has traumatised me, I can assure you. And to my astonishment, because you don't know if you don't do any stats, I discovered there are stats wars. Stats wars, who'd have thought it? So Cohen's kappa is a measure of inter-rater reliability that's widely used in the literature. And for quite a long time, I'd only come across Cohen's kappa. Lots of educationalists were referring to it, using it to measure inter-rater reliability in educational content analysis. But I came across Krippendorff alpha, who, in academic terms, absolutely slags off Cohen. Absolutely destroys him mathematically about his analytical tool, and presents a much stronger case for a slightly different way to measure inter-rater reliability. So that was a bit of excitement on my study. So I'm using Cohen's kappa, which is a measure of the disagreement. So you look at where all my raters have disagreed on whether they match a learning activity to a particular category, and you look at where they've disagreed and what the expected disagreement was if they were doing it by chance, and you produce a figure, a statistical figure. Krippendorff's alpha allows for messy data as well, so Cohen is much less easy to use where you've got messy data. So because you can use Krippendorff to apply to any number of raters, typically when people have done the inter-rater reliability before, they've used 2 raters, because Cohen only measures for 2 raters. which I think if you're trying to measure the reliability, 2 doesn't seem to me to be very many really. So I had 4 raters, and Cohen allows for that. And you can have any number of categories. You can use any metric, any measure, and it allows for missing data, which Cohen doesn't. So it's a reliable statistical tool to use to measure the inter-rater reliability. In terms of what's acceptable or not, this is where stats gets into the realms of, well, you know, it's a hunch. So there are views. Krippendorf says that if we have an inter-rater reliability of something between 0.6 and 0.8, we can say that what we've got is an agreement that is more than you'd expect by chance. That pretty much this is an objective measure. Pretty much, but it's much of a hunch. Okay, so that's what I did. I developed, as I say, 5 pilots, had a go each time, varying levels of success. And what you've got in front of you now is the kind of final version that I'm doing for my final study. So I wanted, I know Lisette had allowed me quite a long time, but I've talked about the stuff I wanted to talk to. But what I'd really like to invite you to do now is to look at the tool that I've got and to have a look at the sample activities that are on there and see if we can all do it ourselves. Is it scary or what? Okay, so I can't actually, let me just see. I've got one left. Just go to. Do you fancy that? Does everybody want to have a go at that? Yeah? I just have a look at this. Just opening it up on here, then I could just overview the So you'll see at the top is the description of the categories, the code book with the description. Then underneath in the table, just trying to, here we go.
Yes.
Well, I'm just, now that I've got it open, what I'd like to suggest is, for this exercise, if you have a look at this is essentially the categories, the coding. So there's 2, after all my principles and all this, that and the other, it's down to 2 categories. This is what was most effective. What we're looking at solely are whether the task includes any interaction, and if there is any interaction, who that interaction is with, whether it's with the tutor, it gives you some examples, a webinar, a lecture and so on, with other students, for example in a forum discussion, or interactive content. So is there some kind of computer simulation that's giving some kind of interaction? So you look first to see if there's interaction in the activity. Secondly, is there specific reference to how the student will get feedback in this activity, some kind of assessment? And if there is, what kind of feedback? Is it from the tutor, for example, a grade? Is it from peers, as in a peer group activity? A self-feedback, for example, if they've been given a model answer or a self-reflection task, or some kind of automatic feedback, for example, through a computer mark test, or again, a simulation. So those were the 2 categories that seemed to be, at the end of the pilots, the most robust. So if you're happy with those, what I'd like to suggest is then that you look at, so underneath, there are just some samples, just 5 examples from the distance learning courses that we were looking at. You'll notice that 2 and 2A were originally one activity, which has been split, so you rate each one separately. So what I'd like to invite you to do on your own, first of all, and then we'll compare and discuss, is to look at each of those 6 tasks and see if you can categorise them, either interaction type 1 to 3 or feedback type 1 to 4. If it's neither of those, if there's no interaction and no feedback, then you simply put in a tick in the other column. So it's something else. There's no interaction, no feedback, it's something else. Okay, is everybody all right here? If you could do it on your own, perhaps on some note paper or something to start with, and then we'll share. So if you haven't got a hard copy, just make some notes. So that's a spare hard copy.
Oh.
Now, I'm not going to take them in.
Okay.
But there's some peer review. I might take them in later.
I've got plans on them.
Just make some notes, yeah. Just make some notes, yeah. Just be interesting, once you've had a go, to try and compare with each other. Is everybody all right? Not even any cookies here.
It's because you said the reward, it was going to be at the end.
Oh,
Once you completed it. Yeah,
sorry.
that's fine.
No, I stopped giving out cookies when it kept going so hard. Blamed the ratings, that's what you do.
This is really good. Yeah, we really, really like this.
All right.
Yeah.
Glad you said that.
So that if that means ending later, then I'm sorry. It just means those, it just means please note. Something like that. Sorry about that.
Is it? Yeah. Yes, I know. Give everybody a few minutes to finish. When everybody's more or less finished, then we can compare notes. Okay, if you finish and there's somebody next to you who's also finished, if you want to just compare, see what your outputs are.
What should we? Does it have to be in twos, or are we going to do it
No,
in
you get
four?
a tick in the first
Oh no,
column.
as in.
Oh yeah, twos off leaves. Yeah.
That's fine. I didn't know which side of the wars we were going to end up on. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Tick in this column, it's no interaction and no feedback. It's a kind of check.
Tick in this column, there's no interaction or feedback, you mean like that?
Yeah.
That's very easy. We have the first one. There's no interaction.
Yeah. So, yeah.
No interaction.
Yeah.
The second one has no interaction.
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of self-feedback and a kind of reflection, self-reflection. It's treated to gain guidance, so you can so you can read the I don't know. It's in the area. It refers to the read, so read, and learn. To create a guidance is a kind of reflective action.
But it's not actually asking them to do the reflection, it's just asking them to produce it. It's not saying who it's then going to be reviewed by, pass it to your peers. So I had that as a no.
Yeah, I see that. You agree on? Okay.
If it was to say, and you will get feedback from the person.
And share it with your colleagues.
Yeah.
And then there's an opportunity.
Okay.
What did you get done? For number 2.
Yeah.
We agree on it.
Okay.
Number 2-8.
I had 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
2 and 2.
2 and 2.
Oh, I had 2 and nothing.
Oh, right.
So nothing for the feedback.
Well,
So it's a comment on each other's work.
oh, I'm just okay. I'm just reading it. I was reading the notes here, and it said a structured peer assessment exercise.
How structured is that?
Would it be formative? It's required state.
It's got in here.
Yeah.
They're commenting on each other's work, so it just.
There's no rubric to guide students
No,
about
but there isn't that kind of detail.
I think this is showing up the difficulty of categorising.
But yeah, what you need to add in is a
This is
rubric.
what it's meant us to say. It's guiding us towards
So number 3, 2 and 3.
Okay, everybody. So I'm not quite sure how to gather a kind of general feedback here. Would you say that you're more or less in agreement with each other? Yeah, it feels as though, I'm not sure the best way to do this, it feels as though they're in agreement with the person that they talk to.
Discussion, so you have interaction with your peers, with students.
So we've broken through convention. We're actually doing a big group thing over here. So there are parts of joining up and parts of hang on, this isn't quite clear and we're not quite aligning.
All
So
right,
it's an interesting dynamic.
Interesting.
We found that where we're not fully in alignment, it's where there's ambiguity in the nature of the activity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Oh yes. There is ambiguity in the nature of the activity, and this is the first thing. That, of course, when we're trying to analyse learning activities, there's huge amounts of difference in the type of language that people use, what they mean by that language, how they've expressed it, what's implied. Because all you're seeing is a tiny little bit of text, and the tutor may have got loads of other information about how the discussion forum was to be used and so on. So what we're looking at is actually a real microcosm of the learning activity, just as a way to focus down on these two things. Now, what I didn't talk about was why the choice of feedback and interaction. And that was because in my original attempts, which didn't work, I used the principles, and they were just far too vague, to try and say whether a task was student-centred or teacher-centred, so difficult. But I kind of used the feedback and the interaction as a kind of quick checklist, is there some of this or not? And that seemed to be easier for people to rate. Plus, the literature also focuses on the importance of interaction and distance learning and the importance of feedback, and I know there's quite a lot of discussion about those this morning. So it seemed sensible to focus on the things that people were able to categorise and that were crucial. So that's why we came up with those. But even at that, what I thought was much more straightforward language, it's very difficult. So we've certainly got issues with the types of language that teachers use when they're describing activities. And these, remember, were hopefully some of the teachers that had previously worked with me on using the best practice template as well. So we might have expected, to see some of that evidence, but I didn't really. And we might have also expected to see some evidence of good practice in terms of interaction and feedback. But when we did the categorisation, it was interesting, and I've gone back and talked to the tutors about the fact that actually, although they often aim to include lots of interaction in their courses, when I've gone back with the feedback and said, well, yeah, to all these activities, yes, you've got 3 or 4 discussion forums early on, and then it kind of disappears. And it allows them to very quickly get a review of the overall course and match it against their own perceptions. So I'm not able, I don't have the time to do some quite big course design activities. It is all on the onus of the tutor. So giving them as a tool is helpful. The other thing that's proved useful, which I hadn't quite expected, was the impact on the people who participated in the study. So all my poor raters, who got cookies at the beginning, but then none later on when it wasn't working very well, all said how much it made them reflect on their own practice. And I think this is quite interesting because this is allows people to review and reflect on their own practice without needing to feel as though their own practice is actually being investigated. So all of them looked at this and they went, oh yes, I'm going to go away and look at my own activities. Have I mentioned interaction? Have I referred specifically to feedback in my own activities? So the very act of actually evaluating another course encouraged and made people feel able to evaluate their own course in quite a clear way. Okay, so any other comments or questions on this?
Yeah, on the last point, it seems to me that if you give this to academics as a very easy tool to sort of go through their design and check how much interaction and how much feedback they have, even if what they come up with would not necessarily match an objective external evaluator, just puts them to think about that.
Yeah, exactly. But if we can also give some assurances that actually, this terminology is the same, other people mostly would agree with the same categories as them. So it's not just a subjective analysis of their own course. They could say somebody else looking at it would come up with something similar. So I think it's useful as a subjective, but I'm also hoping more objective tool. Thank you.
That was very useful. Just a couple of, first of all, your comment about when you showed to people they found they had less interaction than they thought. Is that so that matches our experience with learners I know you as well? We are similar to this one. My course is really interactive with plotting. But I wonder if when you've been talking to academics, whether any of you feel there's a kind of implied value judgment in your categorization. You're saying these things are better than things that score as other.
Yeah. Well, there kind of is. There kind of is, really. Because distance learning now is expanding at the university, and we've got a lot of courses that are very assimilative, and we know that they are both problematic for student retention, student engagement, and for tutor engagement. So it is a matter of looking at the course to see what aspects of interaction and feedback are there or not, and if there are ways that we can enable tutors to build them to some extent. Yeah. So there is an implied value.
I think what we found so far is that by doing this for a long period of time, it balances itself out. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see if you'll find the same.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm interested in the use of this to support, as we were talking earlier, and seeing about the idea of the role of the learning technologist and how certain technologies can then support certain areas. So someone might come in and say, I want to use PebblePad or I want to use blogs, and actually say, well, what do you want to do with them? And actually having them say, well, actually it's not a blog that you're wanting, it's a slightly different thing. But equally to say, if you're using this type of technology, here are the different ways that people are expressing how to do that and the instructions for the learners on how to do that. I think this is really quite an interesting...
It kind of focuses the mind on the kind of instruction you're giving to students as well, because we did find some quite loose descriptions of the tasks. And as I said before, the academics are developing these things on their own for their own students. So I know that they're working in challenging situations, but we did find some what I found quite confusing descriptions of activities given by tutors to students. So it does help clarify for them the type of language to use and focuses their mind. I hope. Yes.
I like your work.
Thank you.
The thing you want to mention is concerning the feedback, it seems to be very much centered on assessment activities. So there is a kind of an element of, let's say, extrinsic motivation for the learner there. Could it be the case that if there is interaction, there's a sort of feedback? Because any interaction provides this kind of feedback. It doesn't take the assessment directly. However, it's going towards the direction where somebody gets feedback by having interaction with peers.
I quite agree, and I do think that interaction and feedback are the same thing, that you can't have a forum discussion without some kind of feedback. But it was partly to do with having some terminologies to categorise things against, plus it was also to highlight where there was assessment happening that wouldn't be picked up by assessment because by interaction, because what we sometimes would see would be a whole series of straightforward tasks and then an assignment at the end, and we know that there would be feedback implied in that, but there was nowhere to reflect that. So our learning design would be losing that. So it was to try and incorporate that. But yes, I agree that they are interlinked. But what was interesting is that over the studies that we found, there was very little reference to feedback throughout. So that although we might want to encourage people to have formative tasks and flag those up as some kind of activity, there were very few.
Is the standard problem we have in higher education that we interact with students and students do not realize that this is feedback.
Yes, that's
and
right.
They write in surveys that they receive that feedback.
Yes, I was just hearing recently, I think it's Bath, who have got placards that the staff have got to hold up that says, I'm giving you feedback. Right, this is the end of the session, so here's a plaque. Right, now I'm going to give you group feedback. And so the students can see it. It's a bit... Okay, any other? Oh, sorry, yeah.
I thought it would be interesting to see to design some activities using learning cycle to begin with.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, use your categorization to actually assess how perception is.
Yeah.
When you are actually designing from the ground.
Yeah, because I've looked at quite a lot of the tools, and in the main, my colleagues haven't used many tools because they're often working, as I say, independently, and so using a tool or a framework is quite challenging for them. But certainly this alongside another tool, I think, would be a useful, because what I found that when the final version, in fact, I've just recently done, was actually quite quick. So once I trained my raters, and they were happy with the terminology, they were actually quite quick at going through the courses, whereas when I'd started, it was so difficult because there were so many things I didn't understand, so difficult to categorise. It took a long time, and I know you mentioned, Lizette, didn't you, about the time that it takes to do the mapping exercise against these categories, whereas to my kind of amazement, now whether it was, just the tea time, or at the end of the day, whether it was that, or it was straightforward to do, it was quick. It was quick. Okay.
Quick follow-up. First of all, I don't think you're really shy about saying that learning design is different. I mean, all the literature says that, interactivity and assessment. I would advocate the category of active versus passive. And the other thing is, I don't think that the fact that there's a forum discussion necessarily means that there's feedback, or you can tell me a lot about forum discussions which don't really even have social interaction. If you don't structure it right.
Yeah, I agree, and I think in some cases there will be, but not always. What I haven't looked at, of course, is what the students actually do. So all we're looking at here is what the activity is, what the teacher has intended or described to the student. What I'm not looking at this moment is what the students actually do. And in fact, I had a conversation with one of the tutors who had set up a whole series of videos for students who are doing computer programming. So his learning design was a series of videos and documents each week with and the task to post your comments and questions in the forum. So he scored very highly on, yes, every week we do an activity with the interaction in the forum. So I asked him how these forums had gone, and he said it was terrible. Hardly anybody, it's optional, he said, hardly anybody uses them, and when they do, they just post, all the work that they've been doing, there's no discussion. So I haven't looked at what actually happens in the discussion forum, but what I am interested in looking at is what the teacher intends, what their learning design intentions are, so that we can try and map those against the evaluation. Okay, thank you all very much. I appreciate the questions and your feedback, and I'm really interested in hearing back from you if you want to share your own experiences or ideas. So thanks again for inviting me.